Hey guys, welcome to chapter 54. It's all about community ecology. So in the last couple of chapters we've been talking about the interplay between living organisms and their environment. In the previous chapter we talked about population ecology, which was the interaction of the individuals of a same species within their group. So like maybe all the white-tailed deer within a particular forest, or all the oak trees in a particular area, or all the butterflies that live in a particular field. That would be population ecology. Now we want to kind of spread that out just a little bit further, widen our lens just a little bit, and talk about community ecology. Community is all the living creatures within a defined area. So not just all of one species, not just all of the butterfly or all of the white-tailed deer, but all of the living creatures. So if we were to look at the community of a particular East Texas forest or something similar, we would look at the plants, the animals, and how they interact with one another. We're not quite taking into account the non-living portions in community ecology, so we're not really looking at weather and soil and things of that nature, but we're looking at the interplay between all the living organisms. So this really gets into, say, predation and food chains and symbiotic relationships and all the various things that occur between different types of species that share the same environment. It's pretty hard to believe, but this is our next to the last chapter, so we have one more chapter to go. And chapter 54 about community ecology is really starting to wrap us up as far as the entire year goes. So let's go ahead and move forward and take a look at our overview and see what it says. It says a biological community is an assemblage of populations of various species living close enough for potential interaction. So again, all the living creatures that live in a particular area that interact with one another in some way. A community is all the biotic components, all the living parts of a particular area, and that area is usually defined by the researchers. So for example, we could say all of the creatures that live on your farm, and maybe your farm is 20 acres in size, or all the creatures that live on this particular school campus, or something like that. Usually it's the researcher who does the definition of the land area that we're talking about, but all the creatures that interact and live in that area would be considered the community. There can be a wide variety of interactions between community members. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. If you are a member of this community, there are some other members of the community you might consider friends in some way, and there's others that you would consider enemies or foes. A good example that they start with there in the textbook is this little carrier crab. This little guy carries a sea urchin on his back for protection against predators. So here you see the crab, and here you see the brightly colored spiny sea urchin, and this guy has picked him up and placed him on his back, carries him around. If there's a big fish or some other creature that might come to attack the crab, he will kind of squat down into the sand or into the dirt and allow this sea urchin to kind of form a shield to ward off predators. So there's a relationship that exists between these two living creatures. Now you might want to figure out what type of relationship is that. Obviously the crab benefits, or he wouldn't use the sea urchin as a shield, but what about the sea urchin? Does he benefit from this relationship? Or is he not harmed or helped, or is he perhaps harmed in some way because of this relationship? And we'll kind of talk about and define the differences between the various symbiotic relationships between community members in just a second. So we're going to get started with our first concept, 54.1. Community interactions are classified by whether they help, harm, or have no effect on the species involved. And so again, a good example would be our little carrier crab and the sea urchin here. Is this a win-win situation, or a win-neutral situation, or a win-loss? It kind of depends on the particular interaction. Ecologists, when they look at these relationships, they term these interspecific interactions, the relationships between various species. And you've heard these terms before. They can be competition, predation, herbivory, symbiosis, and there's a variety of symbiosis, parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, and facilitation. And so we're going to discuss some of these as we go throughout this chapter. Interspecific interactions can affect the survival and reproduction of each species, and the effects can basically be a win-win, a positive-positive, or they can be negative, or they can be neutral, no effect whatsoever. And when we kind of look at both sides of the relationship, that's when you determine if it's good for both, or what category of relationship does it fall into. The first type of relationship we might want to take a look at is called competition. Interspecific competition is a negative reaction. In other words, it's bad news for both members of the relationship here. This occurs when species are competing for resources that are in short supply. So when species are competing for food or shelter or land, they are in competition with one another. And in this case, a great example would be like the lions and the hyenas that live on the savannas of Africa. They oftentimes will eat similar materials, they share a similar overlapping range, so they are very much in competition, and they very much are enemies. They don't really get along much, and it's a negative. When the hyenas win, the lions tend to lose, and vice versa. So this is interspecific competition. This type of interspecific competition can kind of be maintained at a particular level, but if one species has a particular advantage over the other, this type of strong competition can eventually lead to what we call competitive exclusion, basically the wiping out or the elimination of one of those competing species inside this relationship here. The competitive exclusion principle states that two species competing for the same limiting resources cannot coexist in the same place forever. So again, you have to think on a large scale biological term. If we look at, say, the lions and the other creatures here, the lions and the hyenas, they have been living together in this competition there in Africa for many years, but they have sort of reached a balancing point, and we're going to find out how they kind of divide the resources so that they can maintain this balancing point. But if they were in direct competition and one had a particular advantage over the other, eventually you would see the exclusion or elimination of one of those competing species. One of the ways that they reach this balancing point so that that doesn't occur between, say, the lions and the hyenas is that they find their own little ecological niche. The totality of how the species uses the environment, the biotic and the abiotic factors, is called his niche, and it's kind of like his job description. What does the lion do within the world of the African savanna? What is his day-to-day job or purpose sort of in that biological community? And what you find is these creatures can live together even though they are competing with one another, the hyena and the lions, for example, if they have a niche that differs slightly from each other. They can have similar needs and similar desires, and they can be in competition, but they can't have the exact same job. If they do, one of them eventually is going to win out and begin to eliminate the other. So the way that they can coexist is if they have some significant differences in their niches. And there's actually a pretty wide variety of ways that animals do this, where they can maintain competition, they can live in competition with other creatures, but they don't wipe each other out. They reach this balance point because they have divided the resources, and that's because they have different niches, different jobs, different priorities, you might say. One way to do this is resource partitioning, and that's the differentiation of ecological niches that enable the species to coexist in a community. So for example, they show in this picture you have 3 different types of warblers, which is a little songbird, and they very much need the same sort of environment. They eat a lot of the same foods, so they are in direct competition with one another. But the way that they partition the resources enables them all to live together. I wouldn't say happily, they're in competition, but to reach sort of a balance point, a homeostasis that you might consider it in an ecological sense. So here we have the Cape May warbler, and it shows where he spends most of his time and lives on the tree, makes its nest, the bay-breasted and the myrtle warbler. And you notice you can have all 3 of these species, competing species, living within the same trees and forests, but you notice they kind of stick to their own little area, and they kind of have their own particular little niche or job or habitat that they try to stick to. And that way they subdivide all the resources to where they're not in direct competition all the time with their neighbor there. Another good example here of resource partitioning is between these lizards. These are lizards that are found in the Dominican Republic, but you can find similar lizards here in North America as well. And so these guys, they may live in a very similar area, but some of them spend different amounts of time in different areas. So you may find that some lizards spend virtually all of their time high up in the treetops, in the branches. Others spend their time lower along the tree trunk. Others like open areas, say the fence. Others prefer the ground area. And so they have all of this same environment that they're sharing, but because they subdivide those resources, they partition those resources, they're able to reach a balance where they all can live even though they are in competition with each other. Somewhat similar to, say, human life. You know, you may have this idealized notion of what you want to do for a living. Like if you had your choice, if you could do anything you wanted for a living, you might say you want to be a pro basketball player, or you might say that you want to be a professional fisherman, or no telling what it is. That would be your idea. Well, if you're talking about the animal world or the biological world of animals and plants, they sort of have that too. A species' fundamental niche is the niche that it potentially occupied by that species, the idea. So this word here, the fundamental niche, would kind of be like if it could have its dream position, its dream job within the biological community, that's what it would be, the fundamental niche. That's the niche that it potentially occupies if there were no other competition. And again, that's kind of like the idealized version. Now, in the real world of human beings, you don't always get to do exactly what you want. So maybe you have a fallback position and you say, well, I wanted to be a professional basketball player, but I'm only 4'11" and I can't jump 6 inches off the ground. Well, you might want to have a backup plan. And maybe your backup plan is to become a nurse, or maybe your backup plan is to go into computer programming. Well, that may not have been the perfect ideal, but it still could provide you a great a life that would give you everything you need. If we're talking about biology and ecology, a species has what they call a realized niche, and that's the niche that it actually occupies in reality. So the ideal would be the fundamental niche, and the actual would be the realized niche. And the difference between these two is almost always caused by competition with other species. So as a result of that competition, a species' fundamental niche may differ from its actual realized niche. In the textbook, they give an example of these two different types of barnacles, and the presence of one barnacle species limits the realized niche of the other species. So they did a quick little experiment, and when these two species of barnacles are living in the same environment, you notice the Balanus, the blue ones, tend to live lower toward the waterline, and I don't even know how to pronounce this one. We'll say these Thalmus or Chalmus, they tend to live higher up on the land, further away from the waterline. This is their realized niche. Both of them are in competition with each other, and maybe this is not their ideal, but this is their realized niche. Now, if we remove one of these species of barnacles, we may see a change. Over time, we see the fundamental niche of this particular species is actually all the way from high all the way down into the water. This is what they would prefer, and if they didn't have any competition, this would be their fundamental niche. But usually speaking, they don't get that because they are in competition with these guys, and so their realized niche is smaller than their preferred fundamental niche due to the competition. Another good example that they talk about in your textbook is not even partitioning the resources by space, but maybe by time, what they call temporal partitioning. There's a type of mouse called the common spiny mouse, and then there's another similar species called the golden spiny mouse, and they show temporal partitioning of their niches. When they are all by themselves, both species are normally nocturnal, active during the night. So if they're not in competition with one another, like say there's an island which only has one of the species, well, they're going to be nocturnal. But when they are in competition with one another, when they're both in the same place, what happens is over time the golden spiny mouse becomes diurnal, active during the day. That way it's not in direct competition with the other mouse that is up nocturnally at night. So this is called temporal partitioning, where they're sharing the same space, but their foraging activity differs, one in the day, one in the night, and that keeps them from being in direct competition with one another. So there's a lot of different ways that they can divide up these resources, and they can partition these resources to maintain a stability in their competition that doesn't end up wiping out one or the other. Another good way to see this is to look at the characteristics of species that share the same range or the same area, the same environment. You get what it's called character displacement. That's the tendency for characteristics to be more divergent in sympatric populations than in allopatric populations. And let's break down what we're saying here. If you have two species of birds that share an overlapping range, in other words, we have two sympatric, geographically overlapping populations, you'll find that the characters of those birds, say the beak size and the beak shape and some of the various characteristics, tend to be quite a bit more different than they would be if they didn't share the same space. So what we're saying is these characteristics become more divergent when they're sharing the same space if you compare them to two populations of the species that are geographically separated. And a good example of that would be beak size in populations of two species of Galapagos finches. This is a good example we've gone back to for a wide variety of our examples throughout biology in the last semester and even in the previous semester as well. So here we have two types of finches, and you'll notice they have two slightly different beaks, and what we're looking at is beak depth. That would be the distance from the top portion of the beak to the bottom portion of the beak. Recall that the Galapagos Islands is a whole chain of small little islands, and on some of those islands both of these birds exist, and on others only one of the species exists. So here we have this particular island, the Los Hermanos Island, and on that island only this one particular species exists, and this is its range of beak depth. And then on Daphne Island, this other species is the only one that exists, and here's its range of beak depth. And if you compare these two, there's quite a bit of overlap. So when they are separated from each other, when their ranges don't overlap, their beak depth tends to be pretty similar. But then if you go to one of the islands, the Santa Maria San Cristobal Island here, where they both exist, actually this is probably two different islands, where they both exist, look what happens to the beak depth of the two different types of finches. They are quite a bit different. This particular one ranges way down on the lower end of the scale, whereas this one is on the higher end of the scale. And notice that neither one of these kind of matches up with all of their other species on the other islands. So what you see is when you have population overlap, you have characteristics that begin to diverge, and that's another way of trying to be different from your competition so that you're not competing for the exact same resources. Perhaps this different beak depth allows them to eat slightly different types of seeds or slightly different foods. So when they're not in direct competition, they don't have to worry about that, and so over time evolution doesn't put that into motion, and so they have very much the same beak size, beak depth overall. But once they're in competition with each other, suddenly there begins to be divergent evolution, and you see these changes that occur. So that would be called character displacement, and again that means in sympatric populations where they have geographic overlap and they're more in competition with one another, you're going to start to see characteristics diverge or differ. If you compare those populations to populations where they don't have that overlap, that would be allopatric, geographically separated populations. So that kind of wraps up our first type of relationship. That would be competition. That would be a negative-negative. In this case, both of them are going to be coming out on the worse end for competition. So that's a negative-negative relationship. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one, and then we'll take a break. And this is one you're probably very common with, one we talk about quite a bit when we talk about community ecology, biology, and it would be predation. Predation can be identified as a positive-negative relationship. In other words, one of the members of this relationship is going to benefit, and of course one of them is not going to benefit because he's going to be the one getting eaten. So it refers to an interaction in which one species, the predator, kills and eats the other, which is called the prey. Some feeding adaptations of predators are pretty common. We've talked about those, how evolution has adapted these traits and these physical characteristics such as claws and teeth and fangs and stingers and poison, and they're all about predation. They're all about either attacking and killing so that you can feed on the prey, or in some cases they're also used as defense to fight off your enemy so that you do not get eaten yourself. So in this relationship right here, this is a predation relationship. It's a positive-negative interaction, and I don't even have to tell you who's getting the positive end and who's getting the negative end of this particular relationship. The cool thing about predation is it's not just a one-way street. So if you are the prey, oftentimes evolution has adapted you over time for defense mechanisms, defensive adaptations, and some of those could include different methods of hiding, like camouflage, different methods of escape, fleeing, forming herds or schools, self-defense sort of mechanisms, alarm calls. All of these are behavioral defenses. And then there's also physical defenses that we can talk about as well. So just in the way you act, you have developed over time through evolution these various adaptations to help fend off your enemy and keep from being eaten. So this predator-prey relationship leads to what we call this biological or evolutionary arms race, where there's a consistent battle via evolution of greater defenses and greater methods of attack, sharper claws and faster legs and that type of thing. Animals also have physical or morphological and physiological defense adaptations, and like I mentioned, there can be camouflage, cryptic coloration, different types of bright colors, warning signs, and the like. And these again are all part of this arms race. So your enemy may be gaining sharper claws over time, but perhaps you are gaining greater ability to camouflage. And when I say you, I mean your species, because we know that any individual animal or creature doesn't evolve, but the species changes and evolves over time. Lots of great examples of cryptic coloration or camouflage out there in the animal world. Here's a canyon tree frog who looks so similar to the rocks that he's laying on there, difficult to see. You see this like in seahorses. If you look in the notes folder, there's videos of seahorses that camouflage themselves amongst the seaweed and that material. So you're probably very familiar with all different forms of camouflage, whether it's a chameleon that camouflages itself in the trees, or an octopus that has the ability to change its coloration and blend into its environment, things of that nature as well. Sometimes what we see in nature is not a blending in, it's not a camouflage, it's not a hiding mechanism, it's exactly the opposite. It's what we call aposematic or aposematic coloration. It's basically a warning flag where you have animals who have some other form of defense, usually some form of chemical defense. Maybe they have poison glands, or they have the ability to secrete materials that would make their predator sick or kill them. They might not try to blend in at all. They might try to do the opposite and exhibit these bright warning colors. Predators are particularly cautious in dealing with prey that display such coloration. Over time, the predators learn that, hey, this color pattern, or this color of moth, or this color of snake is bad news. It can make you sick, or it can kill you, or something to that effect. And there happens to be an evolutionary adaptation that occurs throughout the species, where certain species learn to avoid certain colorations, and so you start to see these patterns across many different species. So for example, if you look at poison dart frogs, some of the most brilliantly, brightly, crazy neon colored creatures in the rainforest are poison dart frogs, and they are definitely not trying to blend in or hide. If you've ever gone to a zoo that has a nice area where they show snakes and amphibians, you might have seen some very cool brightly colored poison dart frogs. They are certainly advertising, and the reason they're advertising is it's a warning signal, because they can secrete various chemicals through their skin that can sicken or kill their enemy. And so that bright coloration is a warning to say, hey, you don't even want to try to bite me or eat me, because you're going to be sorry for that. What's cool is we have some creatures who don't have those chemical defenses, who have co-opted this idea of these bright colors, who have co-opted this idea of aposematic coloration, and that's called Batesian mimicry. Batesian mimicry is named after a particular scientist who kind of studied this and determined a lot about this. So in some cases you have a species that doesn't have poison glands or the ability to attack or make the predator sick, but they mimic creatures that do. They mimic creatures that are unpalatable or harmful, even though they are not. And so they are faking their way through not being attacked. Great example in your textbook is this hawkmouth larva. This is actually a caterpillar, but this caterpillar has a certain coloration, and it can puff out its body in a way that it looks like a snake head. But this is not a snake head at all. This is coloration on the back end of a caterpillar. And then we have like certain snakes have the ability to puff out their skin or to act in a certain way that will mimic very harmful poisonous snakes, even though they are not. So this green parrot snake has the ability to mimic a snake that looks a lot like it but is highly poisonous, and so they're getting the benefit of looking like something else. A great example here in North America is a coral snake and a king snake. There are certain types of king snakes that have the red and yellow and black coloration of a coral snake being a very poisonous snake, and a king snake not. So you have to learn, there's a particular band of coloration that can separate them, but for the most part, if you were just a raccoon and you saw your brother raccoon one night try to kill and eat a coral snake, he got bit and died, you might learn just to stay away from all snakes who have the red, yellow, black coloration, and so then that benefits not only the coral snake but also the mimic, the king snake mimic. There's actually even a couple little nursery rhymes that I just pulled up right here on the internet to differentiate between the coral snake up here, which is venomous, and the scarlet king snake, which is non-venomous. If you look closely, they both have the red, black, and yellow coloration, but they're not exactly in the perfect exact matching pattern. So some of the rhymes down here tell you red touches yellow, kill a fellow, red touches black, friend of Jack. So up here you see the red and the yellow touch, that is a venomous coral snake. Down here the red and the black touch, and that is the non-venomous king snake. Now if you're a human, perhaps you can remember this information. Perhaps you can remember some of these little nursery rhymes down here. But if you are a hawk, or if you are a raccoon or something like that, I don't think you're very good at nursery rhymes. You're probably just going to avoid all snakes that have this sort of coloration. There's one other form of mimicry I wanted to mention, and that's called Mullerian mimicry. This is where two or more unpalatable species resemble each other. Remember I said that there begins to develop patterns over numerous species. So here we have Mullerian mimicry, where we have two unpalatable species that kind of mimic each other. So there's a cuckoo bee and a yellow jacket, and you might notice that there are numerous types of wasps that have this same coloration, and this is a signal that can be given to their potential enemies that, hey, I have the ability to sting you, or I am unpalatable, I'll make you sick if you eat me, or something like that. So sometimes there are multiple species that begin to take on the same physical characteristics or traits to warn off their potential enemies to avoid predation. So that would be Mullerian mimicry, where you have two or more unpalatable species that resemble each other. So here is kind of a quick overview, and then we'll take a break. So here are all of the different ways, or some of the different ways, that species have physical traits to avoid predation. Cryptic coloration, another word for that would be camouflage. The opposite of that would be aposematic coloration, where it is a bright warning signal. Then we have Batesian mimicry, where a harmless species is mimicking a harmful one. And then we have Mullerian mimicry, where you have various harmful species look alike, or various unpalatable species mimic each other or look alike. We're going to take a break right there. So far we've been talking about competition, that was a negative-negative, and now we've talked about predation, which was a negative-positive. We're going to get into some of the other interactions between species in just a second. We'll take a break. We'll be right back.